Hi, in this little video, I just want to show you a couple of ideas for things that may work for people in terms of planning for sound design or post-production. So these are just a couple of things that work for me. I'm not necessarily saying it's the right way or the only way to do things. The thing about Pro Tools is that there's usually many different ways that you can use the tools or the options to set up things and what that might work for you and your workflow. So what I want to look at specifically, I guess, is things like using markers and clip groups as kind of markers or tools for planning, and export session info as text option to have a look at making some cue sheets potentially or planning things. So let's have a look. I've got this little post project in here that I set up. And now what I'm going to do is I might do some typical things like, for instance, I'm going to set my marker here for scene one, or I might set it as first frame of picture, start, whatever it might be. So in this case, I might give it also some identifier. So scene one, car, whatever it might be. They start off in a car. Okay, and so markers are great, and I might navigate through and find where my next scene change is, which is just about here somewhere, and put in a marker. Now, how pedantic I am at this stage is really a matter of choice. I can kind of watch through, might be watching through typically, and just enter a marker as I go, or else I might scan through. The other thing that I find useful for navigating around is the nudge tool. So when I get close to particular places, I might use the one frame nudge to then click backwards or forwards using the numeric keypad and the plus or minus on that numeric keypad just to move forwards or backwards a frame at a time. So there's my scene change. So scene two, and this time they're in the office. I might have some other kind of identifier for that, depending on what I decide. So I've just got a couple of markers there. I've got my memory locations window open. So now I've got a really quick list of all my scene changes. This is also really useful for other things that I want to navigate to quickly. So key hit points, problem areas where I've got to get back to, things like that are all really great to have. I also put something in at the end of our session. So wherever it might be. And somewhere there. So end, or last frame of picture. So if I ever need to then select my whole film, well, it's pretty easy doing that, but or scenes, etc., I can just multi-select between two different points, for instance, to select my scene. So that's all really useful, the memory location stuff, and that's great. Memory locations, I don't tend to use it for every little thing because this list can get really huge really quickly. But certainly for key things that I want to be able to navigate around to, then that's really great. I just want to show you another option for things that I use for planning purposes at least. And to do this, I'm going to make a new track. I'm going to just stick with a mono audio track in this case. And let's just make that a little bit larger for the purposes of this. So it's not actually this particular project that I have in front of me, but for another project that I've just started working on, which I can't really show you at the moment because it's not quite ready for showing people. But I just want to get planning my backgrounds. Basically what happened is that I was actually also the location soundy for the shoot. I tried to record some ambience at key locations whenever I could, and I actually went out there with a surround recording rig when I got the opportunity to. So I've actually got some stuff recorded from production, from the shoot, but I need to really get that organized, and I'm just not really sure what's in the film and all that sort of stuff. So what I'm going to do here is actually just kind of come up with a bit of a list or a plan for what I actually need and see what I've got to work with. So I'm going to call this track BG Guide for Background Guide. And basically what I do is I might go, okay, well, that's scene one effectively to about there. And at this stage, I don't tend to be too pedantic about my how big my, or how accurate, should I say, my selections are here. This is just big coarse values here. And I go, okay, well, that scene there is all outside, or it's actually, in this case, it's actually, we'll say it's in the car. There's more than one background that I want in this particular instance, but we'll keep it simple. And we'll say it's all car interior. So what I like to do at this point is I'll make a clip group. So the shortcut for that is I'm on a Mac, so it's Option, Command, and G. This makes a clip group. So this is on my audio track. It doesn't actually make real audio. It's not sort of taking up disk space per se, or certainly not much. It's only just a grouping. So BG int for interior and car. And I might be more specific about what sort of car or what's going on. If it's an exterior, then I'll BG Ext. So for instance, if the next scene is in a forest, obviously, or it's not, but I'm going to say that it is just for the purposes of this example. So another clip group, double click it to name it, and we'll call that one BGX forest. Okay, so as I go through, I just sort of can keep a bit of a track of things, and this one might be back to an interior of the office. So I've now got this track, this guide track that has this list of backgrounds. In my clip group here, I've got all these listed as I go on, which is really potentially useful anyway. So I can actually select my clip in the clips list to go to that particular point as well if I want to navigate around to some degree. So how useful is this or not? Well, I'm finding it useful at the moment, which is why I'm sharing it with people. Now, in terms of doing this, what I might be doing is I might be just sort of spotting this as I go. So I might be playing my session. At the moment, my session is set up to be continuous scrolling, which is probably not overly common for me. I probably use a page at a time mostly, but in this case, I actually kind of like it. And that's just so that I can actually have some other selections going on while it's scrolling along. And I can do, okay, make a new clip group. That one was whatever it might be. That one's can be Ext Suburban Street. Obviously not exactly matching the action that we have there. So that's sort of the idea that I have for that. So I'm just keeping this kind of list of our different backgrounds. And if I want to, I can sort of change up how things are working in here in terms of my linking, etc. At the moment, I've got my insertion following playback so that when I stop, that just can continue on from the same point, which is good for me at the moment. The other thing is, though, if I do this, and let's say I make a selection here and I'm doing something to make a group and I stop it, I kind of lose my selection at the moment, and that's because my link, timeline, and edit selection is on. That is a very common way to have things set up, and that's how I normally have it set up for most of my work. However, sometimes, like if you're doing this, you may decide to unlink that, so that reason being so that we can play, I can make selections wherever, make a clip group, name it. In this case, we'll say, I don't know, a church. Okay, I stop. My insertion point is still at my playback header, my cursor here, and I've got my separate edit selection here. It doesn't really mess with each other, so to speak, so I can keep those separate. So that, in this particular case, is useful for me. It may or may not be useful for you. It's just an idea. All right, so that's all good and well. That's just part of the picture, though, in terms of what we can do here. What I want to do, I'll often want to use or get a bit of a spotting log, I guess, a bit of a cue sheet of sorts out of this so that I can use it so that I know what I've got to work with or what I need. This doesn't have to be just for backgrounds. You can use this for Foley or for sound effects cues, maybe even for ADR in terms of lining up things and making up a cue sheet, so to speak. So I find all that really useful for marking out. Let's have a look at what we can do with that. So I'm going to go to my file menu now. I'm going to choose export, and there's an option in here, session info as text. Now, at this point, I actually just want to point out this isn't the only way to do this sort of thing, and there might actually be arguably better ways depending on what tools are available to you and what the workflow is. For instance, I'm just going to open up a web page here. Sounds in Sync is a company that make all these little apps or utilities that are really useful for getting things in and out of Pro Tools. One here, for instance, Eddy Load, will be able to take an edit decision list from a video editor and be able to put that in as a track in Pro Tools so that you can have their kind of, you can see where cuts are essentially from the video editor. There's some other different tools in here that might be useful to people as well. So that Sounds in Sync if you're interested in checking out some of those little options in there. In this particular case, I'm just going to use what we have in Pro Tools to make a cue sheet. And I want to keep it a little bit simple, so I don't need my whole file or clip list. That will include all this sort of stuff over here. I will include markers. So at the moment I've only got 3 markers, but that's okay. I don't need plugins. And I do want track EDLs, so include track EDLs. EDLs being edit decision lists. Essentially what that includes is what clips we have on any given track and in and out points and durations and things like that. That's actually what I really want in this particular case. Our time format, I do want my time code format. I do want it to match that. So, okay. And let's just save that to, I'm just going to save that to the desktop. Okay. And let's then have a look at what that looks like when we go to our desktop. So here we are. Now, I'm just going to make this a little bit larger for us to look at. So what we've got here is some session info at the top, track listing, and this is kind of what I think is the most useful stuff. So here's my BG guide track, and what I now have here is effectively like a cue sheet of my different backgrounds that I require, including start time, end time, and duration. So I get an idea of how long I need. So I find that potentially very useful. Markers can do a similar thing. So we can have our location of our marker and our, in this case, I've got scene changes, etc. I kind of like doing it this way because I can have different tracks with different clip groups on them. And then I can have, so for instance, in this case, it's backgrounds. I might have a particular sound effects track for cues. I might have ADR markers, etc. So I can actually have all that and export it in this way. And I've got a kind of neat package. The other thing about this is I'm just opening this in text edit at the moment, but we can open this up in something like Excel. Okay, and have a look at that. So I'm just going to resize that so that it all kind of fits. And this is it. This is that information in Excel format. So I've got a nice table format. Now, if I wanted to clean this up as a bit of a cue sheet of sorts for backgrounds in particular, I might just delete this extraneous information that I don't require for that. And maybe I don't need channel or event. Maybe I might leave event in this case. It's just like a queue number, so to speak. I might add my own column for something like source. So for instance, do I record it? Is it from production recordings? Do I need to source that from a library, etc.? Sometimes it's more than one of these things. For things you might need multiple or options or layers to create some depth to what you've got going on. So that's just the idea there. Something that I find useful in my sound design planning. Now, I'm actually going to throw one more idea at you guys, just in case you're interested. There's a book called Sound Design by David Sonnenschein, which I hopefully have pronounced his name correctly. Here's a picture of it. The book, The Expressive Power of Music, Voice, and Sound Effects in Cinema. So it is actually a really good book. It's got some really good points. I think one of the main things that I really kind of liked or took away from it was David's idea of a visual map for plotting out themes or emotions in terms of your film. So whether this is useful for you or not might depend on your project, but basically the idea is that you think about what your themes are of your film, and you basically plot out how things are sitting against that theme at any given point within the film. So I'm just going to show you a little bit of an example of how we can kind of mimic that idea within Pro Tools itself. And I can just take a track. It probably doesn't matter what sort of track actually. I'm going to go with an aux input and mono in this case. And I'm going to call this the name of whatever a theme is that I'm going to need to is explored within this project. So let's say our main character has this issue of isolation from a community. So the theme might be isolation, perhaps is a different way of putting that. So basically what this is going to do is can use this to map out how isolated my character is feeling at any given point in the film. So to do this, basically it's an axis. So if we say the top is isolation, more isolation, the bottom is not really isolated at all, so part of the community, etc., accepted. So I can just plot this out now, depending on what's happening in my film, to, so maybe it starts off as part of the community and then, starts to get, go out on his own, etc. And we can kind of plot it in, and maybe there's a few points in the movie that it goes upwards, backwards and forwards. I might just change my scrolling options here so it looks a little bit better. So let's go to page. Cool. And, so I can basically plot it out against that. Now, that's okay in really big, broad, sweeping terms with my pencil tool. I could do it multiple ways, basically. I don't have to do it that way. If you want to watch it in real time and just go for feel, you could, depending on how long the project is and the time that you have available to you, because we don't always have all the time in the world available to us. But we could actually just put that track into right, and we could play through, and I could just take my fader and I could write. Now, I'm probably a bit too zoomed out for you to see, but I can just use an actual control surface fader to write how I'm feeling about it at any point. And maybe I don't need to move it too quickly. Usually it's just in small increments. But the idea behind this for me is that at all times, by having this here in the session in view, I have that in at the forefront of my mind of that theme or the emotion that sort of might be attached with that. And so as a sound designer, I might be thinking about, okay, what can I do with that interior, that background that can add value to the sound design, and that it can, highlight that isolation. Okay, so that's just an idea for people. I don't know if people think it's a good idea or a bad idea, or if it's useful, but I just wanted to share that in case it is useful for your project, because I think that these ideas are useful for me and they might be useful for others. Thanks for listening in.